Let me tell you a story that starts on a night so dark the devil himself would have lost his way. Out in the raw, untamed heart of the Arizona territory, where mountains clawed a bruised purple sky, a young woman was about to learn that falling isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. The worst thing is who catches you. She was running from a man the world called respectable, and she fell right into the arms of a man the world called a savage. What happened next, in the silence between two worlds, would set the whole territory on fire. And it starts with a promise that had to be broken. The air in the little clapboard house was hotter and thicker than molasses in July. Outside, the sky was boiling. Thunderheads the color of old iron were rolling in over Mescal Ridge, and the whole town of Dry Creek was battening down the hatches, praying their roofs would hold. Inside, another storm was breaking. "You'll do as you're told, Marianne." Her father's voice cracked like a whip. His knuckles were white where he gripped the back of a chair. "Mr. Hollander is a man of means. Good land. Coin in his pocket. Any woman in this territory would count herself lucky." Mary stood by the window, her whole body rigid. The reflection that stared back was a stranger, pale face, eyes blazing with a fury that scared her. "Lucky!" The word was a poisoned dart. To marry a man twice my age with liquor on his breath and a temper meaner than a cornered rattler? "You call that lucky, Papa?" Her mother fluttered a handkerchief near her lips, her eyes wide with fear. "Child, your father just wants you to be secure. Times are hard. We can't protect you forever." "I never asked you to," Mary shot back, her voice shaking. "I can make my own way. I would rather take my chances with the wolves on that ridge than be shackled to a man I despise." Just then, a crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the house. The windows rattled in their frames. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. Her father's jaw was set like granite. "You'll wed Hollander before the harvest," he said, his voice flat, final. "This conversation is over." And in that moment, something inside Mary snapped. It wasn't a quiet break. It was a violent, shattering explosion of will. She snatched her shawl from the peg by the door, ignoring her mother's gasp. She threw the door open, and the storm hit her like a physical blow, rain driving in cold, angry needles. She didn't flinch. She ran, past the neat little fence, past the woodpile, straight toward the dark, looming wall of pines that marked the start of the wilderness. Behind her, her father yelled her name, but the thunder swallowed it whole. She was already gone, running on pure, uncut rage. The trail up Mescal Ridge was a treacherous ribbon of mud and stone, and the storm was doing its best to wash it away completely. Mary's boots slipped, her skirt, heavy with rain, dragged at her legs. Lightning tore the sky in half, flashing the world into stark, terrifying black and white. She didn't care where she was going. Away. That was the only destination that mattered. Every ragged breath was a declaration of war. Every painful step was a cry of freedom. She would not be a piece of property, bartered for grazing rights and a bag of coin. If her own family couldn't see the woman she would carve a new one out of the wilderness, or die trying. The air was thick with the smell of wet sage and pine, the smell of a world that didn't care about marriage contracts or a father's iron will. It was honest, it was real, but freedom, she was about to learn, always comes at a price. Near the crest of the ridge, the trail narrowed, skirting a sheer limestone ledge. Below was a 50-foot drop into a rocky, unforgiving wash. On a clear day, she would have picked her way with caution. But tonight, blinded by rain and fury, she didn't see the loose scree. Her boots slid. The ground simply vanished from beneath her. A single thin scream was ripped from her throat, but the storm was too loud. It didn't hear. It didn't care. She tumbled down, down, down into the roaring darkness, her body striking rock and brush, a rag doll tossed by a merciless god. Then a final sickening crack as her head struck something solid, and the world went black. Jack Hale didn't like storms. They reminded him of another night long ago. A night of fire and screaming, when soldiers had burned his world to ash. He was half Apache, raised by his mother's people after his white father had vanished. He lived his life in the spaces between, not truly welcome in the world of the white man, and a painful reminder of that world to his own people. So he kept to the high country. The wind didn't judge. The pines didn't whisper insults. He was checking his snares when he saw the lightning lance down, striking the crest of Mescal Ridge. He felt the thunder in his bones. He knew that trail. He knew how it turned to slick clay and death in a downpour. He was turning back for his cabin when his eye caught something. A patch of pale blue unnatural against the dark, churning mud of the wash below the ledge. It was a dress. His heart hammered against his ribs. He moved with a speed born of instinct, his moccasins silent on the wet stone. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself. A woman, lying twisted and broken at the base of a cedar tree. He dropped to his knees beside her. Rain plastered her dark hair to a face as white as bone. A nasty gash at her temple oozed blood, staining the mud a darker shade of red. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse. Faint, shallow, but it was there. She was alive. He looked up at the ridge, his eyes scanning the darkness. Was someone chasing her? A husband? A father? He saw nothing but the storm's fury. He knew the smart thing to do. The safe thing. Leave her. If the men from Dry Creek found him, a half-breed, carrying an unconscious white woman, they wouldn't ask questions. They'd find the nearest tree and a strong rope. His life wouldn't be worth the breath it took to plead. But his mother had taught him a different code. A code not written in any white man's law book. You don't leave the helpless to die. Ever. With a grunt, he slid his arms beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, almost fragile. He cradled her against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder. He stood, the rain soaking them both to the skin, and began the long, careful walk back to his hidden cabin. Every step was a gamble. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The cabin was a mile north, nestled so cleverly between boulders and ancient pines that you could walk right past it and never know it was there. It was his sanctuary, and he was bringing the world he'd run from right into the heart of it. He kicked the door open and laid her gently on the simple bunk against the wall. He coaxed the embers in the hearth back to life, feeding the fire with dry cedar until a warm orange glow filled the small space. He tore strips from a clean shirt, fetched water from his rain barrel, and began to clean the wound on her head. It was a deep cut, but the bleeding was slowing. She stirred once, a soft murmur escaping her lips, a name he couldn't understand. Easy, he whispered, the word feeling foreign in his throat. You're safe now. He knew it was a lie. She was in more danger now than she had been on the ridge. She was in his world. He tucked a worn wool blanket around her, then sat on a stool across the small room, his knife resting loosely in his hand. He would watch over her. He would guard her through the storm. And when the sun came up, he prayed he would know what to do, because bringing her here might have saved her life. But he had a terrible feeling it had just ended his. The first thing she knew was warmth. A rough blanket, smelling of wood smoke and pine, was tucked under her chin. A fire crackled nearby, a soft, steady sound that felt like safety. She opened her eyes. Log walls. A single small window showing a sliver of gray dawn. A world of shadows. This wasn't her room. Where was she? A floorboard creaked. Her head snapped to the side. A man was sitting in a chair watching her. He was lean, broad-shouldered, with hair as black as a raven's wing falling past his shoulders. High cheekbones, dark skin, and eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow of the land. Apache. A jolt of pure, primal fear shot through her. It was a fear she'd been taught since birth. Stories whispered by the fire, warnings from her father. She scrambled to sit up, the blanket falling away. The movement sent a spike of pain through her head. Where am I? Her voice was a dry rasp. The man held up a hand, a gesture not of threat, but of calm. My cabin, he said, his voice low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. You fell. From the ridge. I brought you here. She touched her temple, wincing at the tender, swollen lump she found there. Images flashed behind her eyes. Rain. The world tilting. The sickening feeling of falling. Darkness. But before that, nothing. A complete and terrifying void. My name, she whispered, her throat closing up. I can't. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. I don't remember. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Pity? Concern? You hit your head hard, he said. The memory will come back. Give it time. There was a quiet authority in his voice that, against all reason, calmed the panic clawing at her throat. She pulled the blanket tighter, a fragile shield against the unknown. Who are you? He hesitated for a moment, his dark eyes studying her face. They call me Jack. The days that followed unfolded in a strange, silent rhythm. Mary, she clung to the name Jack had found on a small locket around her neck, though it felt like it belonged to someone else, discovered her body was a map of bruises and aches. Her head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, and her mind remained a frustrating, frightening blank. Jack was a ghost in his own home. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. He'd be gone when she woke, returning hours later with a rabbit or a handful of herbs. He'd cook a simple broth, leaving it for her on the small, rough-hewn table without a word. He gave her the bunk. He slept on a mat of furs by the hearth, a bulwark of silence between them. She tried to piece together who she was from the few clues she had. Her hands were soft, unused to labor. The dress she wore, though torn and mud-stained, was of good quality. The locket was silver, intricately carved. She was someone who was cared for. So why was she alone on a mountain in a storm? One afternoon, dizzy with frustration, she tried to stand. The room spun violently and she collapsed back onto the bunk, gasping. Jack, who had been sharpening his knife by the fire, was at her side in an instant. His hand hovered near her shoulder, not quite touching her. You moved too soon, he said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a fact. You will fall again. A spark of defiance cut through her confusion. I'm not a child. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than watchfulness on his face. The corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile. No, but a head wound does not care how old you are. A shaky laugh escaped her lips. The sound was so foreign, so out of place in the tense silence of the cabin, that it startled them both. His eyes met hers, and for a long moment, the space between them shimmered with something new. Not fear, not suspicion. Something else. He was the first to look away. He returned to his stool by the fire, the silence descending once more. But it was different now. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions. A silence that felt less like a wall and more like a space waiting to be filled. A few days later, her head clearer, Mary stepped outside the cabin for the first time. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. The cabin was tucked into a small hidden valley, surrounded by towering granite boulders in a thick forest of ponderosa pines. It felt like a secret world, cut off from everything. It's beautiful, she whispered, leaning against the doorframe for support. Jack was chopping wood, the axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful rhythm. He paused, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time. It keeps me alive, he said simply. You live here? Alone? Yes. The single word was a door slamming shut, but Mary was tired of doors. She walked on unsteady legs to where he stood. Jack! He stopped, the axe held loosely in his hand. He looked at her, his face guarded. Thank you, she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. You saved my life. You didn't have to. You could have left me in that wash. He looked down at the axe, then back at her. My mother taught me that a man is defined not by how he is treated, but by how he treats others. She sounds like she was a wise woman. A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of old, deep pain. She was. He said nothing more, turning back to his work, but Mary felt it. She had just touched a crack in the armor he wore. She didn't know who she was, or where she came from. She didn't know what dangers lay outside this hidden valley. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. The man the world called a savage had more honor in his little finger than most men had in their entire souls. And that thought, for some reason she couldn't explain, made her feel a little less lost. Fragments began to return, not like a flood, but like tiny, sharp pieces of glass surfacing in her mind. The scent of lilac bushes after a spring rain, the feel of cool ivory keys beneath her fingertips, The sound of a woman's gentle humming, her mother, and a man's voice, angry, booming. "You'll do as you're told." She would wake up from these flashes with her heart pounding, her skin slick with a cold sweat. The gentle memories were a comfort. The angry voice was a terror. It filled her with a nameless dread, a feeling that she hadn't just been lost on that mountain. She had been running. She didn't tell Jack about the voice. She didn't want to see the guarded look in his eyes intensify. She was beginning to cherish the rare moments when the walls between them seemed to thin. He started speaking to her more, not in long conversations, but in small observations. He taught her the names of the plants that grew around the cabin: yarrow for fevers, juniper berries for tea. He showed her how to read the tracks of deer and rabbits in the soft earth. She, in turn, tried to bring a piece of her lost world into his. She found a stash of flour and dried apples, and after several failed attempts that made him raise a single, amused eyebrow, she managed to bake a small, lopsided tart. He ate his piece slowly, his expression unreadable. "It is good," he said finally. The simple praise felt like a gift. It spread a warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. One afternoon, he led her up a steep trail to an overlook on the ridge, the same ridge she had fallen from. The world spread out below them, a breathtaking tapestry of green forest and distant, sun-baked mesas. "This is where you fell," he said, pointing to the wash far below. Mary stared down, a shiver running through her despite the warmth of the sun. It looked so final. "You carried me from there? All the way to the cabin?" He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk so much for a stranger?" He was silent for a long time, the wind gently stirring his long, black hair. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "When the soldiers came to my mother's village, I was just a boy. They did not distinguish between warriors and women, between the old and the young. I hid, I watched, and I did nothing." He turned to look at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it stole her breath. "I swore that day on my mother's grave that I would never again stand by and watch someone helpless be destroyed. When I found you in that wash, you were helpless. Leaving you was not an option." The air crackled between them. This wasn't just a story. It was a confession. It was the key to the man himself. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, but he didn't pull away. "You're not that boy anymore, Jack," she whispered. "You're the man who saved my life." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her cheek, and he reached up, his calloused fingers brushing it away with a startling gentleness. His touch was like a spark on dry tinder. A jolt of electricity shot through her, and she forgot how to breathe. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the two of them, standing on the edge of the world, suspended in a moment of fragile, terrifying connection. And then a sound shattered the stillness, a low guttural growl from the tree line behind them. Mary spun around. Two coyotes, lean and starving, had emerged from the pines. Their hackles were raised, their lips peeled back from yellow teeth. As she watched, a third slinked into view, flanking them. They were closing in. Jack moved so fast he was a blur. He stepped in front of her, his knife appearing in his hand, as if by magic. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice a low command. The lead coyote lunged. Jack met it with a fluid, deadly grace. The knife flashed and the animal yelped, scrambling back with a bleeding gash on its shoulder. But the other two used the moment to charge. Mary's mind went blank with terror. Then instinct took over. She grabbed a thick, heavy branch from the ground. As one of the coyotes darted for Jack's exposed side, she swung the branch with all her might. There was a sickening thud as it connected with the animal's ribs. It let out a pained howl and stumbled back, giving Jack the opening he needed. A swift kick, a fierce shout in Apache, and the remaining animals turned and fled back into the woods. Silence rushed back in, broken only by Mary's ragged breathing. She stood trembling, the branch shaking in her hands. Jack turned to her. The surprise in his eyes was quickly replaced by something else, something that looked like respect. You fight, he said, a note of awe in his voice. I, I had to, she gasped. I couldn't just let them. He stepped forward and, for the first time, he touched her deliberately. His hands came to rest on her shoulders, steadying her. His grip was firm, strong. You are braver than you know, Mary. She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs for a completely different reason now. The space between them was electric. She could feel the warmth of his hands through the thin fabric of her dress. She could see the firelight dancing in the dark depths of his eyes. He was going to kiss her. She was sure of it. She wanted him to. But then just as quickly as it came, the moment was gone. A shudder seemed to come down behind his eyes. He dropped his hands and stepped back, the invisible wall between them slamming back into place, thicker and higher than ever before. We should go back, he said, his voice once again rough and distant. He turned and started down the trail without waiting for her. Mary followed in confused silence, her heart a tangle of exhilaration and disappointment. She had felt something on that ridge, a powerful, undeniable connection, and she had seen it in his eyes too. But he had run from it. He had seen it, felt it, and deliberately turned his back on it. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was heavy, suffocating. Mary lay on the bunk, pretending to be asleep, watching him as he sat by the fire, his shoulders tense, his face a mask of stone. She knew now that she wasn't just a lost woman with no memory. She was falling in love with her rescuer, and she was beginning to suspect that Jack Hale, the man who feared nothing the wilderness could throw at him, was terrified of her. The next morning, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Jack announced he was going into Dry Creek. He needed supplies, he said. Salt, cartridges, flour. Mary's heart seized. Town. The world outside their hidden sanctuary. I'm coming with you, she said immediately. No. The word was flat, non-negotiable. He wouldn't even look at her. He was checking the cinch on his saddle, his movements sharp and precise. Why not? I can't stay here forever, Jack. I need to find out who I am. Maybe someone there will recognize me. He finally turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was bleak. It is not safe for you, he said. Or is it not safe for you? She countered, her voice softer. To be seen with me? His jaw tightened. The people in that town, they do not think the way you do. They see my face, and they see a threat. They see you with me, and they will see a victim. It will bring nothing but trouble. I'm not afraid. You should be, he said, and there was a weariness in his voice that cut her to the bone. Stay here, keep the door barred. I will be back before sundown. Before she could argue further, he swung onto his horse and was gone, vanishing into the pines like a phantom, leaving her alone with the suffocating silence and 1,000 unanswered questions. Dry Creek was a wound festering under the Arizona sun. Main Street was a rutted track of dust and animal droppings, lined with false-fronted buildings that baked in the heat. Jack tied his horse at the far end of the street, a habit born of long, bitter experience. He pulled the brim of his hat low, trying to make himself smaller, less conspicuous. It never worked. Heads turned as he walked toward the general store. Conversations faltered, replaced by suspicious murmurs. A woman on the boardwalk pulled her child closer, her face tight with disapproval. Someone spat into the dust near his feet. He ignored it all. He had learned long ago that to react was to give them power. He kept his eyes down, his face a mask of indifference. Inside the store, the air was stale, smelling of coffee grounds, leather, and dust. The storekeeper, a paunchy man named Henderson, eyed him with suspicion but took his list. While Henderson gathered the supplies, Jack's gaze drifted to the notice board on the wall. It was cluttered with auction notices and wanted posters. And then he saw it. A handbill, the ink slightly smeared from a past rain. Missing. Underneath the word was a crude, hand-drawn sketch. But it was good enough. The high cheekbones, the determined chin, the wide, searching eyes. It was her. His blood ran cold. He read the words below the sketch. Mary Ann Collins, age 20. Last seen fleeing her family home north of Dry Creek during the storm 1 week ago. Daughter of Samuel and Eleanor Collins. A substantial reward is offered for any information leading to her safe return. Mary Ann. Her name was Mary Ann Collins. He felt a sudden, dizzying sense of loss. The woman in his cabin wasn't just Mary, a person forged anew in the wilderness. She was Marianne Collins, daughter of Samuel and Eleanor. She had a life, a family, a world that was waiting for her, a world he could never be a part of. "Find what you're looking for." Henderson's voice was laced with suspicion. He had followed Jack's gaze to the poster. Jack tore his eyes away, his expression carefully blank. "No." He paid for his supplies, his movements stiff. He could feel the storekeeper's eyes boring into his back. He scooped up his sacks and turned to leave, but Henderson's voice stopped him at the door. "If you know something about that girl, Apache, you'd do well to speak up. Her father's a powerful man in this valley, and her fiancé, well, Mr. Hollander is not a man you want for an enemy." Hollander, the name from the angry voice in her memory flashes. Jack's hand tightened on the sack of flour. He turned his head just enough to meet the storekeeper's gaze. "I know nothing," he said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. He walked out into the blinding sunlight, his mind reeling. Fiancé. She wasn't just a runaway daughter. She was promised to another man. A man her father approved of. A man of power. A man who was likely looking for her right now. As he was untying his horse, the doors to the saloon swung open, spilling a group of loud, half-drunk ranchers onto the boardwalk. One of them, a big man with a florid face, was waving a copy of the same handbill. "Sheriff says she probably got herself lost in that storm," the man slurred. "But I got another theory. I say one of these damn savages snatched her. They're no better than wolves, taking whatever ain't tied down." His eyes and the eyes of his friends landed on Jack. A cold, familiar rage coiled in Jack's gut. He met their hostile stares without flinching. Another man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "If I find out one of them has laid a hand on that sweet little thing, I'll lead the party that strings him up myself." Jack swung himself into the saddle. He didn't spur his horse. He made it walk, slowly, deliberately, right past them. He kept his back straight, his gaze fixed on the heat-shimmering horizon. He could feel their hatred on him like a physical weight. The ride back to the cabin was a blur. The handbill was burned into his mind. Marianne Collins, fiancé, reward. He was living on borrowed time. He had been a fool to think he could keep her safe in his world. He hadn't saved her from the storm. He had dragged her into a hurricane. He knew what he had to do. It was the right thing, the only thing, and it was going to tear his heart out. Mary was waiting for him outside the cabin, a hopeful look on her face that died the moment she saw his. The walls were back up, higher and colder than ever. "Did you get what you needed?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes." He dismounted and carried the supplies inside without meeting her eyes. She followed him, her brow furrowed with worry. "Jack, what is it? What happened in town?" "Nothing," he said, his voice clipped as he put the supplies away. "The town is as it always is." But she knew he was lying. The silence that fell between them that night was a razor's edge. He was a universe away, locked inside a prison of his own making. Mary lay awake long after his breathing had evened out by the hearth, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Something had changed. He had gone to town and come back a stranger. He had seen something, or heard something, that had terrified him. And she had a sinking feeling it had everything to do with her. 2 days passed in agonizing tension. Jack was a phantom, speaking only when necessary, his eyes constantly scanning the trees around the cabin, as if expecting an attack. The peace of their hidden valley was shattered, replaced by a sense of imminent doom. On the third morning, Mary couldn't take it anymore. While Jack was out checking his trap lines, she decided to walk, to clear her head. He had warned her not to wander far, but she felt caged, suffocated by the unspoken fears that haunted the cabin. She followed a small game trail until she reached a bubbling creek. She knelt by the water, splashing the cold liquid on her face. As she looked at her reflection, another memory fragment hit her, sharper and more vivid than any before. She was in a parlor. A man with a cruel mouth and cold, assessing eyes was standing over her. Hollander. He was holding her wrist, his grip like iron. "You will be my wife, Marianne. You will learn to obey. I will break you, just as I break my horses." She gasped, stumbling back from the water's edge. It all came flooding back. The argument. Her father's desperation, revealing he was deeply in debt to Hollander. The marriage wasn't for her security. It was a business transaction to save the family from ruin. Her mother's tears, the feeling of being trapped, a bird in a gilded cage with the gilding rapidly flaking away to reveal the iron bars beneath. She remembered the terror, the suffocating certainty that marrying this man would be a fate worse than death. She remembered running. Mary Ann! The name came back to her. Her name. She pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't just Mary. She was Mary Ann Collins, and she was in terrible, terrible trouble. A twig snapped behind her. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. A man was standing there, not 20 feet away. He was big and bearded, with a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. His eyes were small and shrewd, and they were fixed on her with a look of dawning recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled, a grin spreading across his face. "You're the Collins girl. There's a mighty big reward for you." Mary's blood turned to ice. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. Who are you?" "Name's Jedediah," he said, taking a step closer. "And Mr. Hollander hired me to do a little tracking. Been at it for days. Figured you couldn't have gotten far. But I never figured I'd find you shacked up with an Apache." His eyes flicked past her, toward the cabin, a greasy, knowing look on his face. Her stomach churned. "You're wrong. He saved me. I fell." Jedediah let out a coarse laugh. "That's a good story, girlie. But it ain't the one they'll believe back in Dry Creek. All they'll see is a dirty savage who stole a pretty white girl." Before she could respond, a shadow detached itself from the trees. It was Jack. He moved with an unearthly silence. One moment he wasn't there. The next he was standing between her and Jedediah, his hunting knife in his hand, his eyes burning with a cold, lethal fire. Jedediah froze, his hand instinctively tightening on his rifle. "Easy there, Chief. No need for trouble." "Leave," Jack said. The word was low, a rumble of thunder. It wasn't a request. It was a command backed by the promise of swift, brutal violence. The bounty hunter hesitated, his eyes darting from the knife in Jack's hand to the rifle in his own. He was a big man, but there was something in Jack's stance, something in the absolute certainty of his gaze, that made Jedediah's bravado wither. He spat on the ground. "This ain't over. Hollander wants his property back. He'll get it." He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving Jack, then turned and disappeared into the woods. Mary stared at the spot where he had been, her entire body shaking. Jack turned to her, his face grim, the knife still in his hand. "I told you not to wander." "I remember," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I remember everything, Jack. My name, my family, Hollander, the debt. He was going to. I had to run." Tears streamed down her face, tears of terror and relief. "But I don't want to go back. I can't go back to him. Please." She looked at him, her heart in her eyes, pleading with him to understand. For the first time since he had come back from town, the mask on his face cracked. A wave of raw, agonizing emotion washed over his features. Pain, longing, and a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. He took a step toward her, his hand rising as if to cup her cheek, to wipe away her tears. But he stopped. His hand curled into a tight fist at his side. "You have a family," he said, his voice hoarse. "A home. They are looking for you." "This feels more like home than that house ever did," she cried, her voice breaking. "And what if I don't want them? What if I want you?" The words hung in the air between them, fragile and dangerous. His eyes closed for a brief, pained moment. When he opened them, the walls were back, forged of solid ice. "He will bring others," Jack said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "He will bring Hollander, the town. They will not come to talk." He looked at her, his dark eyes like chips of obsidian. "We have to take you back. It's the only way." The journey down from the high country was a funeral procession. Jack rode ahead, his back a rigid wall of stone. Mary followed, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Every hoofbeat on the trail was a nail in the coffin of the life she had briefly known, the life she had come to cherish. He was taking her back. He was handing her over to her family, to Hollander, to the cage. It was in his mind the right thing to do. It would save his life, and it would return her to hers. To Mary, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. He was choosing to believe the world's judgment over what had passed between them in the quiet sanctuary of his cabin. As the first buildings of Dry Creek came into view, a spire of a church stabbing at the pale blue sky, Mary's stomach twisted into a painful knot. This was it, the end. Word spread like wildfire. A boy playing in the street saw them first, his eyes going wide. He shouted, doors opened, faces appeared in windows. By the time they reached Main Street, a crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of shock, suspicion, and outright hostility. It's her! It's Mary Ann Collins. Saints be praised, she's alive. Who's that with her? That's Jack Hale, the half-breed. The murmurs grew louder, uglier. He must have taken her. Look at her dress, all torn. The savage. Mary slid from the horse, her legs unsteady. In a heartbeat, she was engulfed by her parents. Her mother's arms crushed her in a desperate, sobbing hug. Her father gripped her shoulders, his face pale with a mixture of relief and fury. Mary Ann, where in God's name have you been? The torment you've put us through. Papa, But her words were drowned out by the growing anger of the crowd. A group of men, led by the rancher from the saloon, surged forward, their faces contorted with rage. They were closing in on Jack, who stood silently by his horse, his face unreadable. Let's string him up. He won't be stealing any more of our women. No! Mary's voice ripped through the air. She tore herself from her father's grasp and threw herself in front of Jack, spreading her arms wide, a human shield. You'll do no such thing, she screamed, her voice shaking but clear. He saved my life. I fell from the ridge in the storm. I would be dead, rotting in that wash if it weren't for him. The crowd faltered, taken aback by her ferocity. Her father grabbed her arm. Mary Ann, step aside. You're hysterical. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, she retorted, wrenching her arm free. He carried me to his home. He tended my wounds. He fed me and kept me safe while every one of you was safe and warm in your beds. He is a better man than any of you. Just then, a figure pushed his way through the crowd. A tall, imposing man with cold eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. Hollander. His gaze swept over Mary, a possessive, triumphant gleam in his eyes. Then he looked at Jack, and his face hardened into a mask of pure contempt. So this is the animal that's been keeping my property, he said, his voice dripping with venom. He took a step forward, reaching for Mary. Come along, Mary Ann. Your foolish little adventure is over. Jack moved. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight shift of his weight, but it was enough. He was now between Hollander and Mary. She is not your property, Jack said, his voice dangerously quiet. Hollander laughed, a short, ugly sound. She will be as soon as the preacher says the words. Now get out of my way, you filthy half-breed, before I have you horsewhipped. He lunged for Mary again, and Jack's hand shot out, grabbing Hollander's wrist in a grip of steel. The crowd gasped. Hollander's face turned purple with rage. You dare lay a hand on me? You're a dead man. The men behind him surged forward, fists raised. This was the spark they had been waiting for. Suddenly, a voice boomed over the chaos. That's enough! Sheriff Dobbs pushed his way through the throng, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. He was a hard man, his face a roadmap of tough years, but his eyes were clear and steady. He looked from Hollander's furious face to Jack's calm defiance, and then to Mary's terrified but determined expression. Let him go, Hale, the sheriff said calmly. Jack released Hollander's wrist. Hollander stumbled back, rubbing his arm. Sheriff, arrest this savage, Hollander roared. He kidnapped my fiancée. He assaulted me. The sheriff's gaze settled on Mary. Is that right, miss? Did this man take you against your will? The entire street went silent. Every eye was on her. This was her moment. Her father was staring at her, his eyes pleading, warning. Her mother was weeping silently. Hollander was watching her with a look that promised retribution. And Jack? Jack was looking at the ground, as if he already knew her answer, as if he expected her to choose the safety of her world over the danger of his. She took a deep breath. "No, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that stunned them all. "He did not. He saved me. And Mr. Hollander is mistaken. I am not his fiancée. I will never be his wife." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Her father looked like he'd been struck. "Mary Ann!" Hollander's face was a thundercloud of fury. "The girl is clearly not in her right mind. She's been bewitched by this animal. The wedding will proceed as planned." "No," Mary said, and she took a step to stand beside Jack, her shoulder brushing against his. "It won't. I am not a piece of property to be bought and sold to pay my father's debts." The sheriff raised an eyebrow, looking at her father, who suddenly seemed to find the dust on his boots fascinating. "I choose my own path," Mary continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. She looked at Jack, at his proud, silent profile. "And I choose him." If a bolt of lightning had struck the center of Main Street, it could not have caused a more profound silence. Even Jack seemed stunned. He slowly turned his head and looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the walls, past the armor, and saw the man inside. He looked at her with a raw, wondering vulnerability that broke her heart. Hollander was the first to recover. "You would shame your family? You would throw away a comfortable life for this?" He spat, gesturing at Jack with disgust. "A comfortable cage is still a cage," Mary said quietly. She reached out and took Jack's hand. His hand was rough and calloused, but it closed around hers strong and steady. "I would rather live free in the wilderness with an honorable man than live in a mansion with a monster." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Well," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face, "it seems to me the lady has made her choice. And last I checked, this is still a free country. She's of age. There's no crime been committed here." He turned his gaze on Hollander, and his eyes went hard as nails. "However," he said, his voice dropping, "threatening a man in the street, inciting a mob, that is a crime. And I've also been hearing some very interesting things about how you acquired the deed to Samuel Collins's West Pasture. Things about a forged signature." Hollander's face went white as a sheet. Samuel Collins looked up, his expression one of pure shock. "Now I suggest you and your boys go on home," the sheriff said, casually patting the stock of his shotgun. "And you and I, Hollander, will have a long chat in my office tomorrow morning." Hollander stood frozen for a moment, his eyes darting between the sheriff, Mary, and Jack. He looked like a trapped animal. With a final venomous glare, he turned on his heel and stalked away, his cronies melting back into the crowd behind him. The show was over. The townspeople began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. Mary was left standing in the middle of the street, still holding Jack's hand, facing her parents. Her father looked at her, his face a mask of shame and anger. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just shook his head, turned and walked away. But her mother came forward. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling a watery, tremulous smile. She took Mary's free hand. "He saved you," she whispered. "That's all that matters. Be happy, my brave, foolish girl. Just be happy." She squeezed Mary's hand, gave Jack a long, searching look that seemed to hold 1,000 questions and a quiet blessing, and then she turned to follow her husband. And then they were alone, Mary and Jack, in the dusty, empty street, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and blood. He was still looking at her with that stunned, wondrous expression. "You chose," he breathed as if he couldn't believe it. She squeezed his hand, her heart so full it felt like it would burst. "I chose weeks ago, in a quiet cabin on a lonely mountain," she said softly. "It just took me this long to say it out loud." A slow smile spread across his face. It was the first true, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, and it was like watching the sun rise. It transformed his stern, sorrowful features into something beautiful. He raised her hand to his lips and gently kissed her knuckles. "Then come, Mary Ann Collins," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that made her knees weak. "Let's go home." They mounted their horses and rode out of Dry Creek, leaving the town and its judgments behind them. They didn't look back. Ahead of them lay the vast open prairie, a world of uncertainty and hardship. But they would face it together. And for the first time in her life, Mary felt like she was truly free. The prairie stretched before them like a vast golden ocean, the tall grasses swaying in the evening breeze. The last sliver of dry creek vanished behind a rolling hill, and with it, the last ties to Mary's old life. A profound sense of peace settled over her. They rode in a comfortable silence for a long time. The only sounds the creak of leather and the soft thud of their horses' hooves. Finally, Mary broke the stillness. "You really were going to leave me there, weren't you?" Jack's profile was silhouetted against the deepening twilight. He nodded. "Yes." "Why, Jack?" she asked, a trace of the old hurt still in her voice. "After everything?" "Because that is what the world said was right," he answered, his voice low. "You belong to that world, with your family, your people. I am an outsider, a shadow. To keep you would have been selfish. It would have put you in danger." "It's not selfish to accept a gift that's freely given," she said, guiding her horse closer to his. "And the only danger I was ever in was in that town, not with you. My life wasn't a life, Jack. It was an obligation, a duty. You didn't just save me from a fall. You saved me from suffocating." He turned to look at her, and in the faint starlight, she could see the conflict still warring in his eyes. "But the road with me will be hard. You saw the faces in the street, the hate. They will never accept you as one of them again. They will call you names meant to break your spirit." She reached across the space between their horses and laid her hand on his. "Then let them. Their words are just noise. What we have, this," she squeezed his hand, "this is real. I've spent my whole life being quiet and obedient. I'm done with that. I would rather be hated for who I love than be praised for living a lie." He stared at her, his throat working. He slowly turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a vow, a solemn promise made under a canopy of a million stars. They made camp that night in a small grove of cottonwood trees by a whispering creek. As Jack built a fire, Mary watched him, her heart aching with a love so powerful it almost frightened her. He moved with a quiet competence, a grace that was born of a deep connection to the earth. He belonged here, in the wild open spaces, and she realized, belonged with him. After a simple meal, they sat by the fire, the flames dancing in their eyes. The silence between them was no longer tense or awkward. It was full, rich, and alive with everything they had yet to say. "I love you, Mary Ann Collins," he said suddenly, his voice rough, as if the words were being torn from a place deep inside him. He was looking into the fire, not at her. "I think I have, from the first moment you opened your eyes in my cabin and looked at me not with fear, but with curiosity." Tears welled in Mary's eyes, hot and cleansing. "And I love you, Jack Hale," she whispered. "I think I have, from the moment you showed me kindness when the whole world had taught you to be cruel." He finally turned his gaze to hers, and all the walls or all the barriers were gone. His eyes held a universe of love, of sorrow, of hope. He reached for her, and she went into his arms without hesitation. He held her close, his arms a circle of strength and safety. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. It was the sound of home. This was real. This was truth. This was a love forged in a storm, tempered in prejudice, and born into freedom. They returned not to the old cabin. It was no longer safe, its location known to their enemies, but rode north, deeper into the wild territory, looking for a new place to begin. They found it a week later, a small, hidden valley even more secluded than the first, with a crystal-clear river running through it and mountains that stood like ancient, sleeping sentinels guarding their peace. Together they built a new home, a new life. He taught her the ways of the wilderness, and she taught him how to laugh again. Her hands, once soft and pale, grew strong and capable. His eyes, once filled with a constant, weary vigilance, softened with a peace she had never seen in him before. There were hard days, lonely days, days when the memory of the hate in the eyes of the townspeople was a cold shadow, but they had each other. Their love was the fire that kept the darkness at bay. One evening, a year later, Mary stood in the doorway of their new sturdy cabin, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Jack came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. She was no longer the frightened girl who had run from a cage, and he was no longer the lonely outcast hiding from the world. They had found in each other the missing pieces of their own souls. Out here, where a person was judged not by the color of their skin or the name of their father, but by the strength of their heart and the truth of their word, they had carved out a paradise. They had run from a storm, only to find that the storm had been leading them home all along. This has been a story about courage, about choosing your own path even when the world tells you you're wrong. It's about the truth that real love isn't about safety or security. It's about finding that one person who makes you brave enough to be truly free. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of the untamed heart, do me a favor. Hit that like button and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. It lets me know you're out there, listening in the dark. Thanks for stopping by.